Dawn slid into the driver's seat of her Honda Accord. Her whole body ached from head to toe after the nearly 3-hour sexual workout she had just endured. For years, she had heard the expression, "my jaw hurts," after a long sex session. She was surprised she had never experienced it before, although her husband, Chris, was very well endowed. But today she hadn't spent the second half of the workday with her husband. He had flown out that morning on a business trip for 3 days and 2 nights. She checked into a smelly 24-hour room at a motel with Lori's older brother, her co-worker, Lyle. Lyle left her jaw and throat, as well as the rest of her body, throbbing and ridden. Lyle was a 38-year-old salesman who visited his sister and her family once a year. Apparently, Lyle enjoyed favorite uncle status for his entire family and was known for his exciting adventures, which he enthusiastically shared with his nieces and nephews. They looked forward to his annual visits. Among Lori's co-workers, Lyle was known for other virtues as well. He was certainly tall, well-built, and handsome. His arrogant nature annoyed many, but his incredible stamina and skill made up for his character flaws. Lyle's zest was to have nice, mature, married women and turn them into his whores for the day. Visiting his siblings and their families across the country, Lyle convinced them to introduce him to at least one married woman per visit. Within a couple years, the legend of Lyle Harris had become a tale of a sexy superhero. Many of Lori's married co-workers pondered for 12 months whether they should risk meeting him on their next visit. It was the 5th year since Lori had joined their company, and Lyle was going to visit them next month. It had also been 4 years since Dawn had started hearing about the incredibly erotic day her co-workers had had. 2 of them had bragged about taking it into their own hands. Chris was due to go on tour and had a few days to recuperate, and Dawn had decided to do something she'd never dreamed of: change. Dawn had started thinking about having an affair with Lyle after her close friend had told her about her sexual adventure last year. Joe had tried to count the number of ecstasies she had experienced, but she couldn't give an exact figure. All she knew was that it was by far the best sexual experience of her life. After the date, Joe rededicated herself to her loving and faithful husband and their family. She vowed that it was a one-time thing and would never happen again, and most importantly, that this secret memory would stay with her forever. Nearly a year later, Joe's incredible experience has not affected her marriage or family in any way. She revealed that the sex she had with her husband was better than ever. Dawn reasoned that if she was careful and Chris was out of town, she would like to try what several of her friends had tried. What were the chances that someone as cautious as she was would ever get caught? Having arranged with Lori for her and Lyle to have a play date, she had secretly marked the day on her calendar with the word event. Dawn giggled when she changed the designation to event with a capital letter. If Lyle was even half as good as they said he was, this day would be remembered by her forever. Later, Dawn admitted to herself that the sex hadn't been half as good as she'd imagined. It was 10 times better. When their office came alive on Monday morning, Dawn received a message from someone who wasn't on her contact list. The message read, "I was looking forward to our day together. Lori assured me we'd have fun. Get a room at the Rainbow Motel on Queen Street in Southington. Text me the room number. I'll be there at noon sharp." Dawn was doubly discouraged by the demanding nature of the text on the one hand, and by the fact that Lyle expected her to pay for the room. She smiled, thinking to herself, "I'm glad I saved the sexy thong to wear before the date." Dawn arrived at the motel, paid cash for a 6-hour stay, and had to endure the smirk and stare of the smelly man with the cigar who checked her in. This was definitely not the Marriott hotel she was used to when traveling with her husband, Chris. A half hour before arriving, Lila Dawn had changed into a sexy short cotton summer dress, white panties that were too small to be called thongs, and heeled shoes. High, sexy shoes that would break an ankle. She walked slowly across the room. Her fears had skyrocketed when Lyle was 5 minutes late, and 10 minutes later she was furious. When her phone rang at 12:22, Dawn read, "Confirmed, number 24. I will be gone for 10 minutes. Be 100% naked when I get there or I'm gone." Boiling with anger is the best description of how Dawn heard a knock on the door almost 20 minutes later. She was naked when she opened it. She'd seen pictures of Lyle, but she hadn't realized how big he was. "Lyle?" she asked. "Who the hell else could it be?" "Open the damn door, Dawn." Removing the chain, Dawn opened the door and stepped aside. Lyle was certainly handsome, but at the same time he looked demanding, almost threatening. His intense gaze reminded her of the pervert who had put her up in the motel. "He's looking at me like I'm a piece of meat," she thought for a moment before realizing, "I'm probably looking at him the same way." "Turn around! Do it slowly!" Lyle ordered. Dawn stood on solid ground, slowly looking around Lyle from every angle of her 44-year-old body. She knew she looked 10 years younger. At 165 centimeters tall and 65 pounds, Dawn was gorgeous. Her blonde hair and blue eyes emphasized her typical American face. Despite breastfeeding her son 18 years ago, her size 3 breasts remained high. She made sure Lyle got a glimpse of her flat tummy before turning around and showing off her best features: firm, rounded ass and athletic legs. Lyle pulled off his golf shirt and kicked off his topsider loafers while she stood with her back to him. He was wearing only tight jeans. His height was a good match for his broad shoulders, slim waist, and firm, flat stomach. He shortened the distance between them, took her firmly by the chin, and looked deep into her eyes. Dawn's heart pounded frantically. This man had made an incredible impression on her. She was stunned when he told her, "I'm surprised my sister brought us together. You're much older than most of my whores." It was as if a switch had flicked in her brain. She would show him and be the best married whore he'd ever had. Dawn threw herself into Lyle's arms. The next 90 minutes passed like a blur. They had nonstop fun in 5 or 6 positions that Dawn was very familiar with from her marriage to Chris. They also slept in several positions she had never tried. Dawn awoke after a very short 20-minute nap. She heard the sound of water running in the shower and realized that Lyle was getting himself cleaned up. Half an hour later, both had showered, dressed, and were ready to leave. They didn't utter more than a few words. Upon reaching the parking lot, Dawn expected to hear a thank you or something similar. Instead, Lyle said, "Next year I want to screw Virginia McDaniel. I hope you'll help my sister and make that happen." Lyle leaned over, kissed Dawn on the lips, walked to his car, and drove off. A few moments later, as Dawn was already sitting in her car, she opened the calendar on her phone. She smiled as she was about to cross event off today's schedule and thought, this was an event with 5 capital letters. Chris's event. Capitalized. 29 months later, my alarm clock rang at 4:45 and the daily game began. I listened to Toby Keith's classic song Beer for My Horses for a minute before I heard a thud. Buck, my 11-year-old Australian shepherd, had jumped into the footboard of our bed. She sat silently in the foot of the bed directly between my wife and me for about a minute before her tail began to drum slowly and rhythmically on the wooden frame. The beats became faster and the sound louder as Buck wagged her tail harder. When I growled, "What the fuck are you doing up so early?" Buck threw herself on my chest and started licking my face. It was the beginning of a new day at the Harrington house. December in Connecticut is cold, and the temperature can range from 5 to 15 degrees. As is my habit, I checked the weather before going to bed. 2 sweatshirts, a pair of tight sweatpants, socks, and sneakers would be enough for an hour of morning exercise. Buck and I have a set routine, and 2 or 3 minutes after my feet touched the floor, I was out the door accompanied by my dog. 11 years later, Buck and I were on autopilot heading to the park next door a mile away. The first sign that something had changed was Buck's growling. I looked at the dog, followed her gaze, and together we watched 2 uniformed men get out of a sedan parked by my sidewalk. I remember my thoughts exactly. I was incredibly excited. My son had come home on leave from the Marine Corps. He surprised us and brought 2 buddies with him. When 5 and then 10 seconds passed, and Danny still hadn't gotten out of the back seat of the car, I realized with horror that Danny was not on leave. He's not coming home today or ever again. I would never see my son again. Stunned, I met the U.S. Marine Corps alert team halfway home. If I didn't take the dog out for his morning walk, he wouldn't leave us alone. I glanced at my watch and said, "Could you find the Dunkin' Donuts store and get coffee? Let's meet at 6:30. "Yes, sir," was the immediate response before the captain and sergeant turned around and quickly left. With tears in our eyes, Buck and I headed for the park. We entered the park, and Buck went to inhale the various odors left behind by the animals that roam the field at night. I sat down on a bench and thought of my 20-year-old son with a broken heart. It was as if we had a completely different relationship. For the first 18 years, we had a normal family, or at least as normal as I could ever dream of. Dan was the perfect person. He did well enough in school that he was accepted to several colleges and universities well above average. He was a good athlete and had played on the school's soccer, basketball, and baseball teams for the past 2 years. And he could sing. Oh boy, how he could sing. In his senior year, he played the male lead in the musical production of The Sound of Music, put on by our high school's theater department. Dan was a productive, normal, well-rounded child, but in the spring of his senior year of high school, something happened. In a short period of time, he completely cut his mother out of his life. I tried to intervene, but this was the first time Dan didn't want to talk to me. When Dan started acting aggressive and insulting Dawn, I insisted and demanded an explanation of what was going on. I was stunned when Dan got up from the kitchen table and left the house. He hadn't been home for 3 days. Dawn and I racked our brains trying to determine Dan's problem. We talked to his friends, teachers, coaches, and others, but no one had any idea of any problems. When he finally came home, we sat down together. I decided not to insist, but told him I wasn't going to put up with his gross disrespect for his mother. Using the old saying, I told Dan, "If you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all." That's when the freeze started. He was close to me like good old Dan, but didn't say a word to Dawn. The silence toward Dawn continued throughout his high school entrance ceremony and into the 3rd week of July. It was Wednesday evening when I heard Dan walk into the kitchen. Dawn and I were listening to music and reading in our living room. I assumed Dan had come down the back stairs and was in his bedroom until he coughed. When I looked up and saw him standing in the kitchen doorway, he asked, "Can we talk?" I replied, "Sure." And as I stood up from my chair, I was stunned when he shifted his gaze to Dawn and asked, "All of us?" Dawn and I exchanged curious glances and followed Danny into the kitchen. When he handed me a bank check for $1,000, I asked, "Not that I don't want to take your money, but what is this for?" "It's the non-refundable portion of the tuition you paid to Boston College. I have withdrawn from the college and will not be enrolling in September. The college sends the balance, and you will receive it within 2 weeks." I was confused and threw a series of hesitant questions at Dan. "Did you withdraw? You're not going to Boston? I think it's too late to pay back anything of the nearly $10,000 we spent." Dan told us, "There are several reasons why a family can get a nearly full refund, including the death of a family member or severe illness." Dawn interrupted him and said, "That doesn't apply to us." In the few seconds they were talking, I remembered reading about the Boston College contract in the fine print. I managed to answer, "Or about military service." Dawn turned her head in my direction and just as quickly turned back to Danny. She demanded, "You're not joining the Army." I noticed Dawn relax slightly when Dan said, "I never said I was going into the Army." Dawn had no idea, but I knew what was going to happen. I followed in my dad and grandpa's footsteps and enlisted in the Marines. Dan let us digest his shocking statement before he said, "I had my physical a few weeks ago. I start basic training in 3 weeks at the Recruit Training Center at Parris Island, South Carolina." "You're not going, and that's the end of our discussion. You're going to college." My thoughts were still swirling, and I was focused on the tabletop as Danny explained to his mom. "This is the funny thing about the Marine Corps. They didn't send me an invitation to basic training. They don't say please. I'm under military orders, and I can either report on time or go to military prison. Aren't you going to say something? I could feel Dawn's eyes drilling into the top of my head. I shrugged, looked at Dan, and asked the only question that mattered. Why? I needed to know. It was Danny's turn to stare at the tabletop. A pleasant silence ensued, broken occasionally by Dawn's sobs. After a few minutes, Danny said to us with a sigh, I need to grow up. I want to grow up. I need to become a man. I realized there was more to it than that. When I thought Dawn was about to say something, I reached across the table, took her hands, and, looking her in the eyes, asked her to be quiet. Dan continued. You know it hasn't been like this for a while. I've never been so angry or confused. The worst part is that I can't talk to you about it. I don't have the courage to get together with my family. I can't do that. Dawn asked. Are you gay? I knew from the look in Dan's eyes that his answer to Dawn's completely ridiculous question would be disgusted. I slammed my hand on the table and, channeling the anger that Dawn's question had caused in me, I asked Dan, So you're running away? You weren't listening to me, Dad. I shrugged confusedly as he explained. I'm striving for something. Masculinity. I decided that a 3-year tour of duty in the U.S. Marine Corps was the quickest way to achieve it. My reminiscing was interrupted when Buck rubbed his muzzle on my leg. I grabbed my trusty bat and pulled an old tennis ball covered in spit from my pocket. Using the bat, I batted the ball to the other end of the park. Buck found the ball in the pre-dawn darkness and brought it to me. Chasing a pretty battered tennis ball seemed to be Buck's favorite pastime that day. I think Buck was grumbling because we left the park for home a few minutes earlier than usual. As I walked, I tried to clear my mind completely, knowing that the next few hours and days would be devoted to another world. After making coffee, I went up to the second floor and walked over to Dawn's bed. I leaned over and kissed her cheek. Give me a few more minutes, Chris. I replied, You have to get up at the crack of dawn. We have visitors coming in the next half hour. Wait, what? I told her. I'm going to take a quick shower, and closed the bathroom door behind me. I reasoned, I want to give Dawn a few more happy minutes. I washed and rinsed my mouth in 2 minutes, wiped myself dry, and when I walked into our bedroom, Dawn was pulling her sweater over her head. What's going on, Chris? Tears streamed down my face when I told her. The Marine Corps alert team will be here in a few minutes. Alert. That was all Dawn said before she realized our lives were forever changed. I took 3 quick steps and hugged my wife tightly. I was afraid she was going to fall. We cried together before I suggested we go downstairs. When we got down the stairs, I looked out the window and saw that the team car had returned. Dawn and I walked out onto the porch of our house together. The captain and sergeant immediately got out of the car. As they approached us, the captain said, Mr. and Mrs. Harrington, I'm Captain Peter Lewis, and I'm here with Sergeant Craig Malloy. May we come in? Captain? I asked. Can I ask the sergeant a favor? I could barely control my voice as I looked at Sergeant Malloy and asked, Could you... I couldn't finish and instead nodded my head toward the flagpole at the edge of our yard. Old Glory was lit up in the pre-morning darkness and floated proudly in the air. The sergeant realized it all at once. Dawn and I hugged each other tightly, and Captain Lewis stood at attention and saluted as our flag was lowered. The next few hours passed like a blur. We knew Dan was in Syria. We were told he was part of a patrol. An armored personnel carrier driving ahead of us hit a roadside bomb and caught fire. Dan ran out of the vehicle to save his teammates when a second bomb exploded. Our son died at the scene. When the Marines had filled out their initial paperwork and were ready to leave, Captain Luis asked me to walk him to his car. We left the house and were standing in the driveway when he pulled an envelope out of his pocket and held it out to me. I read my name, neatly inscribed in Dan's handwriting. Under my name were Dan's instructions. Please destroy this letter if it cannot be given to my father personally. When I returned home, I tossed the envelope on the table in my home office. I was in too much pain to read Dan's message, so I decided to wait until dawn and go to bed. Later that night, after drinking 3 glasses of bourbon, I sat down at the table, opened the envelope, and read, "My dear Dad, I'm sorry you're reading this letter. I am sorry for many things, but most of all, I am sorry for the pain you are going through. I hope I can help you with your grief, but I don't think it is possible. In fact, I'm afraid I'll make this horrible day worse for you. As I write to you now, I do not know the circumstances of my death. I pray that I am doing something good, something honorable, something worthy of a United States Marine. The hardest thing I can tell you is that no matter how I died a coward, at least in my eyes. I admire many things about you, but most of all, I admire your ability to face your problems head on. I appreciate the hundreds of face-to-face conversations we've had with you. You have helped me make sense of my problems. I also appreciate our family conversations. You always took the initiative. You never shied away from any topic. You took the bull by the horns and boldly addressed your problems, my mom's problems, and our family's problems. I love you for that. When I was growing up, I tried to emulate your best qualities. However, I missed your problem-solving skills. I was a coward for not being able to talk to my father about breaking up with my mother. I was a coward for not talking to you before I joined the Marines and skipped college. And I'm a coward today because I'm writing to you. A man would have looked you in the eye and explained why I needed to join the Marines. Maybe if I talked to you about it, I would conquer my fears and become a man you could be proud of. Dad, Mom's a cheater. A few weeks before I graduated from high school, I saw a text message arrive on my mom's phone. I didn't peek. The message was rude and confirmed that Mom had a date in a motel room. The date was scheduled for a few weeks later. That's when I started treating her with silence and finding excuses to stay with friends. I avoided my mom. I knew it was going to be bad when it was time for the date and you went out of town for a few days. I skipped school and followed my mom to work. I followed her again when she left work late in the morning and drove to one of those shitty motels in Southington. I watched as she walked into the office and afterward headed to her room. About an hour and a half later, a younger guy knocked on the door and came into the room. He stayed with my mom for a little over 3 hours. They came out, kissed, and went their separate ways. I had my head in the sand, Dad. I made important life decisions without input and wisdom. My father's wisdom. I will never regret my decision to join the Army. I've grown up. I've matured. I have also decided that you and I will have the hardest conversation of my life when I return. I will tell my story sitting with you and my mom at the kitchen table. I'm tired of thinking of myself as a coward, but just in case I don't come home, I want you to know the truth. With great admiration and devotion, I am now and always your loving son. Dan. 10 days after our meeting with the alert team, Dan was buried in our town cemetery with all military honors. The night before the Requiem Mass and funeral, we held a memorial service for our son. The procession of family, friends, and acquaintances lasted 2 hours longer than the allotted time. I think every Marine who ever served and lived within a 100-kilometer radius came to pay their respects. It was a relatively warm December day when Dan was lowered into the ground. Much of the traditional pageantry and ceremony went unnoticed by me as my grief was unbearable. It was on that day that I truly realized the full horror of war. Fathers and mothers are forced to bury their children. Since Dawn and I became the owners of the empty nest, she and I had dinner at her in-laws' house every Monday night. I liked Pat and Mary, my father-in-law and mother-in-law, and looked forward to this new family ritual. Dawn had gotten into the habit of arriving at 4:30 and helping her mom prepare the meal. This week I arrived 30 minutes earlier than usual at 6 p.m. and parked a few houses away. I watched from my car as 15 minutes later the bailiff walked up to the front door of my in-laws' house. There was a slight commotion at the front door as the bailiff staggered toward her car. I waited a few minutes, and after taking a deep breath, I started the car, pulled into the driveway, and headed for the lion's den. As I walked in the front door, I wasn't surprised to see Dawn, Pat, and Mary sitting together on the couch in the living room. They were going over the divorce papers together. 3 pairs of eyes stared at me as I entered the living room and threw my coat on the nearest chair. "In this house, we hang our coats in the closet," Pat bellowed, and the women continued to stare at me. Heading across the room to the bar in the corner and pouring myself an unhealthy amount of very good bourbon, I said, "I won't be long." I took the first sip and wasn't surprised when Pat stood up and turned to face me. Before he could say anything, I reached into my back pocket and pulled out a copy of Dan's letter and held it out to Dawn. He sat down next to his daughter and the 3 of them read Dan's words. After a few seconds, the paper shook, and then sobs were heard. I admit I was shocked when Marine Sergeant Major Patrick Franklin, retired, began convulsively sobbing along with his wife and daughter. "Hire a lawyer and sign the damn papers. Don't call, don't write, don't text. I have 2 suitcases of winter clothes in my car. I'll leave them in the driveway. I'm going on vacation next week. I expect everything you need will be moved out of the house so I can sell it." Taking another throat-scalding sip of my drink, I finished, "I hope he was a good guy. I hope it was the best thing you ever had in your life, and that you've kept those fond memories ever since. I hope they keep you warm in the future, because you lost your family." As Chris turned, grabbed his coat, and headed for the door, the kaleidoscope of thoughts swirling in Dawn's head began to clear. She remembered an event with a capital letter. For the first time in 2 years, the voluptuous memory of it didn't cause a tingle in her heart.